the plant itself can help to change how agriculture works and can kind of serve as a model for how farmers can do better than they have with these other crops. Because if you have a really strange, interesting plant that can do a lot of things, I think this is a crop that will be good for farmers. And I think it can change the math for them.
That's Dr. Mowgli Holmes. He's the co-founder and CEO of Phylos, a plant science company that is trying to revolutionize the hemp industry through data, technology, and expertise. This is the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. My name is Eric Harlock, and on today's show, we have a fairly lengthy interview with Mowgli Holmes from Phylos about plant breeding, cannabis genetics, why sustainable agriculture is the way to go, and we also get into the controversy that Phylos found itself in earlier this year with old-school West Coast cannabis growers. So all that and a whole lot more. First, we're going to take a sponsor break, and then we'll come back with some hemp news items. This episode of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is brought to you by Organic Mechanics Soil Company. Located in Chester County, Pennsylvania, Organic Mechanics has been making and distributing organic, earth-friendly potting soils and soil amendments since 2006. Using quality ingredients like biochar, worm castings, rice hulls, compost, and more, Organic Mechanics provides off-the-shelf solutions as well as custom blends for hemp production. Go to organicmechanicssoil.com or call 610-380-4598. Organic Mechanics Soil Company, providing soil solutions for hemp growers. Today's show is brought to you in part by Think 20 Labs. Think 20 Labs provides analytical testing for hemp growers and processors, offering CBD and THC potency testing throughout the life of the hemp plant, plus full panel certificate of analysis services at harvest or processing time. Testing your hemp products with Think 20 Labs ensures consumers that your products are safe, potent, and compliant. Visit think20labs.com or call 443-420-7489 to learn more. Think 20 Labs, creating a new dimension. Okay, welcome back. So on Monday, October 21st, there was a public hearing in Harrisburg about Pennsylvania's hemp program and Senate Bill 335, which would allow CBD to be used as a food product. And I believe there's also language in that bill that would remove hemp from the state's list of controlled substances, which, as you know, was removed at the federal level by the 2018 Farm Bill. So Pennsylvania needs to reconcile that. Anyway, the hearing was led by the chairman of the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee, Senator Elder Vogel.
As we know, hemp is one of the fastest growing plants and is potential to yield tremendous growth here in the future in Pennsylvania as well as across the country. Estimates show us that the total retail value of hemp products in 2017 was $820 million. And according to the New Frontier data, industrial hemp industry is expected to produce $2.6 billion by 2020 nationally. So obviously this is a great opportunity for our farmers and other people across the country, as well as in Pennsylvania here, to have another rotational crop, another crop, a cash crop on their farms to replace corn and soybeans and hay and things like that.
Senator Vogel was joined by Senator Judy Schwank, who has been
anxiously awaiting this hearing because this is certainly the buzz in the agriculture industry here in the Commonwealth and nationwide, as a matter of fact.
As you may remember, Senator Schwank introduced
Senate Bill 335 that looks at hemp or CBD as a food additive here in the Commonwealth. It's legislation that actually had been introduced and passed in Colorado, and I think would be a way to progress our industry here while at the same time safeguarding the purity of the product and the consumer of the product as well.
I will put a link to the video of this entire hearing on the show page for this episode, but I thought I would share a few highlights. First, Dr. Ruth Welliver. She's the director of the Bureau of Plant Industry at the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. She had this to say about crops testing hot.
Out of 5,000 acres, it's a very small number of acres that have gone over the 0.3. There's a small number of acres that have gone over 1%. And those we are absolutely requiring destruction. We're kind of working with the testing, retesting of the stuff that's below 1% in the hopes that that material is going to be salvageable for the growers, because it might not be a large portion of the acreage, but if it's your acreage,
Yeah.
it's a problem. So we're as sensitive to that as we can be without, losing the integrity of the whole state's crop.
And then a little bit later, we heard from Erica McBride-Stark, the executive director of the Pennsylvania Hemp Industry Council, who explained why it's important to get hemp removed from the list of controlled substances here in Pennsylvania.
Act 92 successfully created the framework for the development of the hemp program. However, it did not permanently remove hemp from the Controlled Substances Act on the state level, as has been done on the federal level. And because the Department of Agriculture's jurisdiction ends after harvest, this is of primary importance as it leaves processors, distributors, retailers, and consumers vulnerable to law enforcement action.
So there's a lot to dig into in this hearing, and I encourage you to watch the video. But what this hearing says to me is that the state of Pennsylvania is committed to figuring this industry out, from a policy point of view, a consumer point of view, and most importantly, in my opinion, from an agricultural point of view. Because for me, it's all about the farmer. And as you know, I'm concerned about farmers getting the short end of the stick. Speaking of which, there is a story coming from Kentucky that is a cause for concern. NBC affiliate LEX 18 in Lexington reported this past Monday that some Kentucky farmers are suing Canna. The farmers say they were, and I'm quoting here, ripped off by a hemp company, leaving them out of millions of dollars. Now those farmers had filed a lawsuit against Canna Global Incorporated, a company that grabbed attention for their research and development of new products. End quote. All right, so I don't like to hear stories about farmers getting ripped off, especially by giant global companies.
Industrial hemp.
You might remember that the CEO of Canna was the keynote speaker at the Pennsylvania Hemp Summit a couple of weeks ago in Lancaster. That to me was sort of an odd choice, raised a few eyebrows, both of mine. But anyway, this is a story that I am following. I am waiting to hear back from Canna for comment. I've also reached out to these farmers for comment, but still waiting, so I'm keeping my eye on it. There's another story I'm following, this one out of Maine. There's a farm that posted on their Instagram page that their bank is about to close their bank and loan accounts because of the hemp crop, and then they were also issued a notice from their property insurance that they've got until November 19th to find another insurer. So we've got to get this banking and insurance situation figured out, because hemp farmers are just trying to make a living like anybody else. Okay, so finally we're getting to sort of the main interview of our show today with Mowgli Holmes from Phylos. It's a fairly long interview, longer than my shows have been lately, so get comfortable. This interview starts non-traditionally, I suppose, where it seems like he's interviewing me.
So how long have you guys been covering hemp stuff?
I have been covering it sort of as a full-time beat for about a year and a half. There's been hemp stories, in farming news, for a while. Obviously since the 2014 Farm Bill, set up the research programs, our newspaper has been keeping an eye on it. Farmers here have definitely been interested. And then, once the 2018 Farm Bill went through, it was game on here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
It is. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of, numerically, how much and how fast people in your region are switching or adding hemp?
Well, last year there were 35 research permits in the state, and this year there were almost 400 permits granted, and
Wow.
That's almost like 1,000 grow locations. So it was a pretty quick ramp up, but it's still really small compared to the rest of the ag commodity crops here in the state.
And do you have the sense that out there people who are jumping in are doing so with sort of 10-acre early trials?
Even smaller than that.
Even smaller?
Yeah, I mean, CBD has sort of, captured their imagination and, dollar signs in their eyes, sort of in that CBD bubble here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, the sense that we've had is that people, I mean, I think what we're trying to get a handle on is, I mean, obviously, it's a crop that is so much more valuable per acre than what other people are growing or
Right.
could be.
Yep.
But it seems like most experienced farmers still have an inherent tendency towards caution and want to start small and make sure they know that all the pieces are in place before they
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. So
literally at the farm.
right. Yeah, I mean, I think most farmers here on the East Coast, they were sort of told in the beginning, like, yeah, go small. No one really knows what they're doing out here, so go small, don't invest too much in it right now. But, this year some people did go pretty big on some, CBD grows. We'll see what happens after harvest. But, yeah, so where are you right now? Are you in Portland?
Portland, Oregon. Yep.
Nice. That's a good place. I was there once.
How'd you like it?
Oh, I spent some quality time in the bus station.
We have a fine bus station.
You do, yes. I was traveling from Seattle to Eugene, and there's like a layover there in Portland. That was way, before the Decemberists, right? For me, that's. Did you grow
That's what
up?
you think of when you think of Portland?
Yeah, a little bit of the music out there for sure. Definitely some cool indie rock coming out of that spot.
Yeah. I've been all over, and I lived in New York a lot as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I grew up mainly out here, mainly in Eugene, actually.
Oh, okay. I spent some quality time there that same trip.
Yep.
Although that was 20-some years ago. It was 97.
Oh, wow.
I was traveling through.
Wow.
I had an internship in Boulder, Colorado for the summer, and I had gotten a ride from some guys that I went to college with. They were surfers who were headed to Alaska to go, to work on a fishing boat for the summer. So they agreed to drive me to Boulder, which they did. I dropped my stuff off, and I didn't have to start my internship for a few more weeks. So I went with them to Seattle and then figured I'd meander my way back to Colorado. I did. I survived. And
why'd you go to Eugene?
I had some friends there, some at the university, some others just living nearby. So I spent maybe a week there, and then I wanted to hitchhike to San Francisco, so they dropped me out on the highway. And my mistake was not taking the coastal road. They put me out on 5, and I was, down near San Francisco by the end of the day. So,
right.
But, you learn these things. I didn't get killed, so that was probably fortunate.
Yeah. It's too bad that hitchhiking, it seems to have fallen out of favor in this country. It was kind of a beautiful thing for a long time.
Yep. Yeah. So, hey, do you want to start the interview in a more formal way?
Yeah.
Can I introduce you?
Sure. Yeah. Go for it.
All right. Dr. Mowgli Holmes, welcome to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Good. Could you give us a little introduction? I'll say first that you are the co-founder and CEO of Phylos Bioscience.
Yeah, so we're a crop science company focused on hemp, really focused on the cannabis plant, which takes many forms. And, the hemp revolution, as some people are calling it, has really been driven by changes around the regulatory and medical status of the plant as a whole. And there has been such an influx of capital and ideas and new companies into every part of this space. And, until the hemp stuff started to get momentum, many people didn't know what to make of this new industry around this plant. And you heard a lot of conversations where people would say, like, it's like a new pharmaceutical industry. It's like alcohol, or it's new consumer packaged goods industry, and people were thinking about sort of the end of the supply chain.
Right.
And a surprisingly small number of people were thinking of it as being an agricultural crop, which of course it is at the base of all those supply chains. And so most of the stuff coming into the industry were companies making products, or there was a lot of capital coming into just cultivation. But no one was really looking at how agriculture and farming works for other crops, and how driven agriculture is by science, and in particular science around plant breeding, that lets you develop crops that are optimized for farmers to succeed with. And so people were just using the plant in whatever forms they could find, or sometimes making a cross or two. And no one was really thinking, this plant hasn't been through the century of scientific plant breeding that every other crop has been, and it doesn't work like a developed crop works yet. It's really not suited for large-scale agriculture yet. It's very well suited for sort of artisanal craft growing in a lot of ways, where you have farmers that can really lavish attention on each plant, but it really has not been turned into a crop that works really well at scale.
Which is surprising, right? Because it's a really old plant. Can you talk a little bit about where this plant came from? I mean, you have a background in plant science, right? How old is this plant, and how long has it been around humans? Yeah,
so it looks like it was domesticated around 10,000 years ago in Central Asia, around the same time that any plants at all were domesticated. And it has followed humans everywhere we've gone since then, all around the globe, and diversified into a surprising number of different kinds of plants that serve a surprising number of different roles. And it is true that it has been used in large-scale agriculture for millennia. What it's missed out on is the last century, where plant breeding suddenly took off, and we learned how to do quantitative genetics, and we learned how to figure out which genes are controlling which traits, which lets you make really intelligent decisions about how to do plant breeding, and it lets you do plant breeding much faster. And so the last versions of this plant that were used for large-scale agriculture were not the kinds of plants we're using now. They were these tall, skinny fiber plants,
right.
Where the length of the stalk was the important thing. But those are not the kinds of plants that are being used today for the most part. And even for those plants, people have been working on them in China and in Europe, fiber hemp.
Sure.
But it hasn't received a ton of attention in the last century in terms of plant breeding.
So there's a lot of catching up that this plant has to do.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So, but fiber hemp really is way ahead. There's a number of consortiums in Europe that have been applying modern plant breeding tools to it. But the kind of cannabis that is grown for CBD is a very different kind, and that plant has never really been studied or improved.
And that's the stuff that is essentially from like the marijuana world.
That's right. And so the interesting thing about hemp today, even though it's called industrial hemp, is that you can drive around a hillside in Kentucky and suddenly come up on a field of what looks like hundreds of acres of sticky marijuana. That's the kind of plants they are. They're only producing CBD though.
Yep.
Because it turns out you can convince the plant in just a generation or two to completely drop production of THC and start producing CBD.
Yep.
It turns out that didn't require a lot of fancy plant breeding. But yeah, that is the hemp that's being grown today is what we would consider a drug cultivar. It's been bred for, the one trait that has been improved is massive production of cannabinoids in the trichomes.
Yeah, there's parts of Lancaster County that the same sort of thing. You drive around the corner and there's a great big field of CBD plants.
Yeah, that's right. And so, it's been very confusing for instance, police. They'll stop a van full of plants and they'll,
right.
And it just looks and smells like the plant that was used as a drug for many years, but it is not at all that. It's a totally legal plant, but it's
right.
sort of hard to tell.
How did you get into cannabis? Like, what is your sort of personal experience, if that's not too personal of a question?
No, that's fine. So I actually wasn't trained as a plant scientist. I was trained as a geneticist.
Okay.
But genetics are genetics. So I had been doing HIV research actually in New York at Columbia University and Rockefeller University, and I moved home to Oregon in 2014, and this new industry was just exploding all around us, and it just immediately was obvious that something big was happening, but there was no science behind it. So me and a friend, with a little early help from a professor at Columbia that I'd worked with, just started to start an actual crop science company for cannabis and hemp, focused on genetics, focused on how we could improve the genetics, how we could understand them and then improve them.
Okay. And that's what led to what's known as the Phylos Galaxy?
Yeah, so that was sort of an early research study that we did, because one of the first things we realized is that there was already a complex supply chain in existence, and it was bizarre and unusual in terms of agriculture because there were thousands of different varieties. The plant breeding process for industrial crops has led to the creation of a smaller number of elite cultivars that are just very, very high yielding, and most farmers use them.
So you're talking about in 2014, there was already a really well-established supply chain, but that was like black market sort of cannabis supply chain. Is that?
Yeah, well, sort of, but in Oregon and California, it wasn't really black market. So there's been a medical market, a legal medical market,
okay, right.
for almost 15 years at that point.
Okay.
And so it was legal out here, though sort of highly and poorly regulated at the same time. But yeah, and people were already starting to think about hemp a little bit. It is the same plant. You can coax it into doing many different things.
Sure.
But there were just thousands of different varieties out there, and no one had any idea what they actually had. And so it seems like an important first step to us to sort of catalog all that variation and look at what was out there and what the genetic diversity was, and to help people make the supply chain more transparent so they could see what they had. And we collected DNA from cannabis samples from all around the world. And we also had a lot of hemp in there. A researcher at the Vavilov Institute, which had at the time the biggest collection of sort of historical hemp varieties in Russia, sent us a bunch of samples, and we were able to sequence all of them and then make this big map where you can see how they cluster, how they're related to each other. And for us, that was really the jumping off point to, once we could see what was out there and everybody could see it, that was sort of a good first step for us to look at all of that and then say, okay, well, now what do we do? How do we?
So you're just collecting a great big data set to complete the picture. So you sort of get a sense of where you are, sort of like like a Moneyball version of cannabis, how they did that to baseball and statistics. You want to sort of do that to the genetics of cannabis?
Right. I don't know that that doing that, I don't know that it's like Moneyball in the sense that, like, if you bring a lot of data to it, it can help you make intelligent decisions. I mean, that's the basic idea behind modern plant breeding, is that you have a lot of data that helps you make intelligent decisions.
Sure.
That data set couldn't help us with plant breeding because, the way modern plant breeding works is you sequence the DNA of plants, and then you study the plants themselves in a lot of detail. So then you can start to say, all right, every time we have a plant that seems to be resistant to powdery mildew, it seems to have this DNA sequence. And so then you can use that DNA sequence as a marker, and in your breeding process, you can make a cross and then collect samples from all the seedlings and sequence them. And then right away you can say, okay, these are the ones that are going to be powdery mildew resistant. Okay. And you get rid of the others. And that just lets you accelerate your breeding process. So the galaxy that we built didn't let us do any of that because we didn't have any data on the plants. Just let us see how they were all related. And so it didn't feed into plant breeding, but what it did was it let people in this crazy complex industry see what they actually had.
Okay.
And so it made people start thinking about plant identity and the importance of individual varieties and the importance of knowing what you actually do have. And
because different varieties are helpful for different, medical ailments, or, you want different effects. So you want to be able to stay with sort of the same, not the strain. I've seen videos where you're like, strains don't even, come into this.
Well,
but so I'm not a scientist, so I'm making it too complex. Sorry.
I think what we just learned a few basic large lessons from that. We learned that nobody knows what they have and that everything is misnamed. And people are assuming that everything with the same name is really the same, or that if things have different names, they're really different. And that just creates a lot of confusion. And we realized that there's incredible diversity out there. And what we realized is that there are no stable varieties. So a stable seed line, which is what real agriculture relies on, is something that has not existed in the cannabis and hemp world. So people would talk about strains as if it was a unique variety, but really they would make a cross and then they'd have a bunch of seeds, and you could buy a pack of those seeds. But when you plant them, they're all different, because until you've done decades of inbreeding, seeds are each unique children of the same parents. And so there was all this diversity. There were no seed lines. There were no clear varieties. There were just all of these sort of thousands of unique individual plants. And it was just very complex, and it let us see, okay, we can tell which plants are more inbred and which aren't. And, we can see, and we made all the data public so everyone could see, like, this is where there's a lot of diversity. This is where there's not. These are the plants that look like they're more inbred. These are the plants that look like they're not. And so anyone can go on that database and try to pick varieties that are more inbred to use as parents for an inbreeding project. They can pick varieties that are more distantly related, which can be very valuable in a breeding project as well. Mm-hmm. And just a few basic things like that. And then we just got to work building, the actual plant breeding program, which we had to go out and collect an entirely different set of varieties. We had to collect living tissue this time, and start to study them in our own facilities and actually do real plant breeding. And so to this day, hemp farmers they're buying seeds, but there are still really no seed lines. So hemp farmers will buy seeds, and they're all different.
Right. When you sort of started focusing on plant breeding, there was a lot of, like, people freaked out about that, right? Like, there was some controversy. Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happened was that, and I think it's a really interesting illustration of the ways that the hemp industry and the old school cannabis industry are interlinked, and the sort of tension between them.
Okay.
So when we collected all that data, we were working mainly with old school growers that we knew and collectors, and we were working very much in this in the cannabis industry, where people are growing flower. They're sort of craft growers. They're growing small farms, and they're high THC varieties. And there's this whole culture around that, and it is a culture that is very, very different than how large scale agriculture works. And in fact, it's a culture where there's a lot of political animosity towards traditional ag and towards the big agriculture companies. And
why do you think
legalization? Well, it's not a mystery. I mean, those companies are very widely disliked for a few reasons. One is that they are seen to have over-encouraged the intensive use of chemicals. Another is because they've made genetically modified plants and resisted having those being regulated. And a third is that they just have fed a kind of consolidation in the agriculture industry that has made it very hard for small farms to survive.
Right.
And so all of those things have created a lot of political opposition to those companies. And when you talk to small farmers, they often share those beliefs. And when you talk to small cannabis farmers, they see big ag as the huge forces that are arrayed against them that are going to come and wipe them out. And when legalization happened, right away, all of those people who had built this industry found themselves fighting for their lives. I mean, they were being wiped out right away. Big capital was coming in, huge farms, and it was becoming very hard for them to compete. And so they sort of saw like, wow, the forces that be inside of large-scale agriculture are coming to destroy us. And I don't think it's crazy for them to look at it like that. When agriculture gets consolidated, it is really hard for small farms to survive. And these guys are all growing organically. And when large-scale agriculture happens, lots of people don't grow organically. So they had lots of reasons to be scared of those companies and of those forces. And I think they are fighting for their lives. It's hard to have a agricultural niche where we're going to have lots and lots of small farms doing artisanal growing and have them be able to survive now that this is scaling up to massive farms. And I think it's important that they do survive, actually, for various reasons, but they're scared and it's hard for them to compete.
Right.
And anyway, so what happened is that we announced that we were doing plant breeding, and at the same time, it became clear to everybody that we were hiring people from those companies.
From the big ag companies.
So that's right.
Okay.
Because we're a plant sciences company, and that's where you get plant scientists from. I mean, 95% of all the great plant scientists in the world work at those companies. And it's always been our job to bring the science from that world and apply it to this plant. And that meant we had one foot in this one community and one foot in the big science, big ag world. And those two worlds are really at odds with each other. So the sort of negative reaction that all those small growers had was kind of inevitable in a way. It's very hard for them to accept that there could be a good company that's working with people from Monsanto. It's just very hard to accept. So it got them very upset. They started saying, you've been stealing our plants. You've been stealing all of our data and information. And you're working with big ag to come and wipe us out. That was their reaction.
Did that catch you by surprise, that reaction?
Well, it did, to be honest. And I guess it shouldn't have. I mean, I think, you can see listening to me talk about it that I see it as sort of inevitable in a way now. But yeah, at the time, it really did catch us by surprise. And I'll tell you why. I mean, one reason why is that you can't steal people's plants because you have some data on them. And you can't steal people's data if you're making it all public. And, you know, we had been a company with a real open source ethos, and we made all of the data public. So we never thought we'd be accused of taking things from farmers.
Right.
And we also never thought we'd be accused of working with Big Ag to come and wipe them out, because we had been part of conversations for years about how to help the craft flower industry survive. And we're a very progressive company. Our politics are, you know, pretty aligned with a lot of those growers, and we there's a lot of things about how traditional agriculture has worked that we don't like, and we
like what, and how would you change it?
So I think the climate crisis has focused a lot of people's attention on this, on the way that big companies that are operating with only profit in mind have really done a lot of things that are really bad for the environment, bad for the climate. And so we now know that agriculture globally is responsible for about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. We also know that it's responsible for a huge amount of pollution, and, you know, overuse of pesticides and herbicides and runoff from excessive use of nitrogen. All of those environmental practices have had a lot of negative effects that, you know, it's easy to see how we got into them. It's easy to see why large-scale farmers depend on them. But they have had negative consequences. And so we really think that agriculture has to move towards a more regenerative mode. And people need to be thinking about sustainability when they farm, and people need to be doing everything they can to keep soil healthy and to minimize the use of expensive chemical inputs. I mean, we're a crop company, right? So our job is to work with farmers and help them do whatever they have to do to be successful. But our hope is that large-scale ag can move towards more sustainable cultivation methods.
So you're committed to bringing those changes.
Yeah, we are. And so our hope is that as we work with farmers who are switching to this new crop, and this is a crop that should really be grown organically for a number of reasons. What our hope is that, you know, we have a whole agricultural tech development team that's working with farmers to help them figure out how to grow this new crop. And they need techniques. You know, it's a new crop. They need to know what it needs and how to grow it. And we are a sustainable agriculture company. So we see it as our job to take that moment to try to introduce farmers who haven't adopted it or haven't adopted it that much to sustainable ag cultivation methods. And, you know, that's a delicate dance. You know, farmers need to be successful. And as we talked about earlier, they are risk averse and they don't want to go all in on something brand new right away.
Right.
But there's a sense among farmers that switching to organic growing leads to lower yields, and that it's not economically sustainable. And so our hope has been that as a science company, we can bring the science to those kinds of growing methods that make them actually work very well. Because when you really dial in no-till and cover crops and organic methods that really keep soil very healthy, you can get incredible yield.
Right.
But there's been sort of a divide between science-based methods and organic methods, and that we see that as a false distinction. We think that agriculture really has to move towards those methods. We don't know how quick it'll be, but it has to.
For our survival as a
species,
you mean?
For our survival as a species, yes. It seems very clear to us that we can't keep doing things the way we've been doing them. And it also seems clear to us that we can't just keep arguing, like the chemistry people on one side and the organic people on the other side. If you really bring science to studying how microbes work in the soil and how organic forms of nutrients can be made available to plants, you can turn organic growing into a very, very powerful tool, but it needs science behind it.
Right.
So
farmers can save the world, but we need to stop arguing about the stuff so we can actually get on to saving the world.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm nervous about overstating it, but farming is actually contributing to global warming. And, but plants are the biggest carbon sink in the world. So many people are starting to think now that agriculture is having a large negative effect on the climate and on the environment.
It's those practices of agriculture. It's not agriculture itself, right? Just the way we're doing it now.
Right, it's the way we're doing it. It's not the inherent nature of agriculture. So the feeling is that it's been having all these negative effects, but that it actually could be having really, really positive effects.
Yeah.
That means that not only can we stop emitting the greenhouse gases and pollutants associated with ag, but that we can turn ag into a net carbon sink where we're sequestering carbon in the soil.
Yes, and we make everything out of plants and we lock up all that carbon. We become carbon negative. Right? It's doable.
Absolutely.
It's doable.
That's right. And hemp is sort of the poster child for this kind of thing because not only does it fix carbon really rapidly, it's good at sequestering carbon in the soil, but you can use the biomass for hempcrete and for bioplastics and for all of these things that
and for paper
keep the carbon locked up.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
So how do we get that shift to happen? Is that like a consumer demand shift or what? How do we do that?
Well, so as we've seen, consumer demand has driven organic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's already some of that. So you already see with a lot of people who are growing CBD that there's a big demand for organically grown hemp and organically derived CBD. Mm-hmm. And so that's a consumer-driven thing. And, if you can get a price differential that supports doing that, that's great. But I actually don't think that's the biggest way. I think that, when we think about improving this plant, we care about the consumer traits, and we definitely care about breeding for the interesting cannabinoids that are going to be really important medically. Mm-hmm. But the main thing that this plant needs is improved agronomic traits that work better for farmers. And my sense is that if we want agriculture to change on a large scale, consumer demand isn't enough. It has to work for farmers. It has to be a way of growing that is better for farmers. And so, and what that means is that, you're not saying like grow in this different way that's difficult and expensive because you should, or because consumers want this and so you can charge a little more for it. I think until we can say, let's grow in this different way because it is better for the soil and your farm is going to be healthier. And when we get it dialed in, you are going to spend way less on inputs. You're going to have way less water runoff. You're going to have way less soil erosion. And as we get your soil more and more healthy, you're going to start to have incredible yields.
Right.
And I think until it is economically sustainable for farmers, it's not the kind of thing that can make a worldwide difference. It has to work for farmers.
Yeah. So that's what you're trying to do at Phylos.
Yeah, and we're not the only people. I think there's a lot of people working on it. If you look at the numbers, so the USDA came out with a report not that long ago. And the USDA, surprisingly, as well as the UN and the World Bank, they've all been really pushing for sustainable agriculture, because of the global effects and because they're seeing so many farmers in third world countries have problem with eroded soil.
Right.
So there's a lot of people pushing for it. But anyway, the USDA came out with this report not that long ago that really quantified how many farmers in the U.S. are using no-till.
Mm-hmm.
And let me ask you, what's your guess? Like what percentage of the acreage for the main crops in the U.S. would you say is no-till?
I'm going to think it's small, under 10%.
It's 30%.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So
that's surprising.
And it's incredible. It's very surprising. But they're not doing it because someone told them it would be good for the environment. I mean, farmers want to make the environment on their own farm healthy.
Right. Farmers are often like stewards of the land. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. And so they're doing it because it's making their own farms healthier, and because it's working for them. And I think we had this sort of idea for that this idea was that to feed the world we had to pull all this nitrogen out of the air and then pump all this nitrogen into the soil and till it up every time, and which knocks out all the organic matter, and then the soil would be kind of dead and in danger of erosion, but that's fine because we can just pump more nitrogen in. And it worked, right? We got incredible yields, but
it works
at the
for
end
a little
of the day,
while,
you have the soil.
but yeah, you're just killing the soil. Yeah.
And that's the definition of sustainability is just having methods that will work and continue to work.
Right. Let me ask you a question that I ask guests pretty frequently. How can farmers avoid getting the short end of the stick in hemp?
Yeah. That's a very good question. I mean, how I was talking about how in the cannabis industry initially, most of the capital, a lot of the capital had gone into just cultivation.
Mm-hmm.
And then you saw this move recently where, prices started falling, and the people with money started realizing, wait, cultivation is not the high returns part of the supply chain. And, they started putting money in other places. And in general, this is a crop that has had incredibly high margins. And even right now for hemp, it has very high margins.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how things generally work for farmers, right? And as it becomes more and more commoditized, prices are going to fall, and farmers are going to find that it's a lower margin crop, and things are going to be tough. And then the only way farmers can survive that is they have to scale up really big, and then the smaller farms that can't do that are in trouble. So all of those sort of basic dynamics that work in agriculture are getting ready to come into play with this new crop. And it's hard to be a farmer and not get the short end of the stick. So I think that with this crop in particular, I think that, so to go back to what you said about consumer demand, I don't think that we can change the world by consumer demand for products that are farmed in a certain way. I think farming in better ways has to be something that works for farmers. But the truth is, consumer demand is something that lets farmers differentiate themselves. So once hemp becomes absolutely a commodity crop, then it's very hard to not get the short end of the stick if you're not able to differentiate yourself somehow. And I actually think that sustainable cultivation methods are one way for farmers in general on a broad scale to not get the short end of the stick. I think that instead of always chasing short-term maximum profits, it lets farmers sit back and think about the lifetime of their farm and build their farm in a way that's environmentally and economically sustainable. I think it's a model for farming where farmers don't get the short end of the stick nearly as much because their main asset, their land, isn't being sacrificed for their yields every harvest.
Right.
And so I think that's one important thing. But in the hemp industry and in the cannabis industry, farmers can avoid getting the short end of the stick by differentiating themselves. I see every farmer fighting against it just becoming a commodity. So right now, and I don't know how this will play out, but right now farms that are growing organic CBD and they're able to get that certified by one method or another and vertically integrate with the products companies, there is a really big demand for farms that are doing things in really special ways. And then even at the products end of the supply chain, you see people trying to give visibility to consumers back to the farmer. They're saying, we buy hemp from this farm that is organic and sustainable. And sometimes in their marketing, they bring through images of the farmer.
Sure, yeah.
And so there's a way for farmers to do things in a great way and then be part of the supply chain in a way that matters to consumers and really get paid appropriately for doing things in a great way.
Right. And that sort of seems like that would work best on a more local scale, right? Like that's sort of like know your farmer, tell the farmer story, and the supply chain. It seems, I don't know, I've been talking to a few people in the hemp space, and they do talk about the local supply chains, like the processing needs to be a certain distance from where the hemp is grown, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. That's right. All of this works better. So having coherent local supply chains that work, it lets you do what I'm talking about more. It lets you be more visible to the end of the supply chain. But also, when sort of local communities form around this stuff, I think you get farms that are way more sustainable economically, for that reason and for a bunch of other reasons too. They're more integrated with the whole supply chain, and often I think that means like they have a stake in the processors. They have, they know the people who are doing the mechanization and the extraction, and they're working with them, and it becomes a local ecosystem where there are a number of ways that farmers can get value, and they can sometimes invest in other parts of the supply chain in a limited way.
Okay.
And because this is when you get large scale sort of global commoditization, and you're just producing biomass and God knows where it goes, it's very hard to. I mean, look, this is what happens with farming. It's very hard to be valuable, to have control of your own destiny.
Right.
And hemp is interesting, right? Because we need processing capacity right now. We don't have it. And it is sort of a chance to create these local markets that are more self-sustaining communities that we've seen before.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you? Are you seeing that start to happen in Pennsylvania?
I feel like there's strong movement for local supply chains. Like that's what a lot of the farmers want to see. Do you think there is room in, like, as Phylos grows, is there the room in the sort of the value system or, business model to, leave room for that local supply chain and those small farmers? Like, that's going to be an important part of maybe your company's philosophy, or how do you see working with small farms?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, there's a conversation that's hard to have without blurring the lines between hemp and cannabis, right? Like the smallest farms out there are cannabis farms, not hemp farms. Mm-hmm. But we're starting to see hemp farms where it looks kind of the same. It's, instead of making biomass for extraction, there has I don't know if you followed this, but there's recently been this sort of explosion in the market for smokable hemp flower.
That's the talk here in Pennsylvania. That's what the Amish are growing.
Yeah. And you can get much better prices for it. And what that means is that suddenly you're getting into a crop that can be grown artisanally.
Yeah.
And flower quality really, really matters. And it's a whole different thing. And for farmers for small farms to survive, they need to be able to leverage the fact that they're small to grow plants that are unique. And that means growing them with, more individual love and attention and creating really, really high quality. But it also means growing interesting plants that have unique flavor and smell profiles, and having access to those. And so the biggest sort of moral tension that we see in being a plant breeding company is that plant breeding has been part of the problem. Like, it's not just neutral science. When you invest millions of dollars in developing new improved cultivars, then you have to protect those plants. You have to patent them. You have to make sure you are making plenty of money from them and that people aren't stealing them from you. And that's how it works on the commodities market, the large scale commodities market. And I don't know how to change that. But the result of that has been that ownership of all the important plant genetics has been consolidated in the hands of a few very large companies that put in all that investment to making new varieties.
Right.
But our belief, and I mean, I think this is, I don't know how the large scale farmers feel about this yet, but our belief is that there should be room for a vibrant community of open source genetics alongside the global market, where there's a few varieties that take over because they have 0.5% increase in improved yield. That there should be a market for diverse and interesting stuff that is not owned by big companies. And you see a push for this in groups like the Open Source Seeds Initiative. Do you know about them?
I've heard about them, yeah.
They are really interesting, and they have a lot of sort of old school university-based breeders involved. And what they want is a world where lots of people can do breeding and lots of small farmers can differentiate themselves because they have really interesting, unique stuff. And where those varieties aren't owned by a couple of big companies, where they're sort of owned by the community the way that seeds used to be.
Right.
And we see that as a really important vision for how the future should be. At the same time, we don't see how that works for the global commodity part of the agricultural supply chain. And so there's just things like that are inherently in tension, and our approach is that it's better to acknowledge those tensions and pay attention to them. And the way we're going to handle that is that when we develop varieties that are for the flower market, a market that thrives on uniqueness and diversity and isn't about like, this is the best new variety, it has slightly higher yield, everyone's got to use it now. It's more about a new entry in a unique ecosystem. When we develop varieties like that, we are going to release them under open source licenses so that everybody can breed with them, everybody can use them, there's no licensing fees, and that all of the breeders, and there's a ton in this industry, can take whatever we've made and freely build on it. And in our minds, that is the biggest thing we can do to help small farmers. I mean, the other big thing is helping them get into collectives where they increase their buying power. But from our point of view, the biggest thing we can do is make sure that a few improved varieties don't wipe out all the stuff that's out there. That there's sort of a side-by-side world of lots of interesting stuff that is essentially open source. And so we're committed to supporting that too, and releasing flower varieties for everyone to work with.
Okay.
I don't know if that does enough, but that's what we see is what we can do.
Let me completely change the subject, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
Maybe it's not completely changing the subject, still within the realm of cannabis. Should the cannabis industry in general, or Phylos in particular, would you be addressing any of the shameful past in cannabis prohibition? And I'm talking, specifically about that now there's a whole lot of rich white guys making more money from this plant that put a lot of people of color in jail and have, destroyed families and, all sorts of things. Is there a responsibility, and how would you speak to that?
Yeah, I think there's a growing sense in the cannabis industry that there is a responsibility. I will also say that I have not heard a compelling idea for how to address it so far. So it is very clear that we had this set of laws that led to total decimation of inner city populations of people of color, where sometimes like a third of all men under 35 are in prison. I mean, just
Right. It's astounding.
yeah, just a set of laws that have been really, really destructive and have served to sort of lock in the racist economic infrastructure in this country. And then those laws go away, and all these like already rich white guys descend and are making all the money. And there's something just sort of inherently wrong about that. And, you know, what we've seen so far is we've seen some local attempts to bring equity into the regulatory structure. So Oakland, for instance, determined that, you know, some percentage of their licenses were going to go to the actual precincts that were most hardest hit by the war on drugs.
Okay.
And that was a regulatory mess, unfortunately. It was so complex to implement that many people didn't feel like it accomplished much. There's some other regulatory jurisdictions where they've tried to do similar things. They're trying to do something like that in Massachusetts. And I think that states should be trying to do that. But it's hard. It's hard to make a big impact like that, I think. Right. And then there's groups like in Oakland, there's this group called the Hood Incubator, where they've said, all right, there's an opportunity for people of color who are in these areas that were hit by the war on drugs to get into the cannabis industry and make money. And, but it turns out that when you take legal steps to keep entire regions impoverished, they're not well positioned to step up and make a lot of money in a system that they haven't been allowed to be part of. Right. So this incubator, you know, was helping people of color become entrepreneurs and helping them with the licensing process and all of that. And that's one group that we've donated to and supported financially. So we do see it as our job to support efforts like that, but there just has to be a bigger plan. And you know, these little projects aren't going to make a huge impact. And so some of the more progressive companies in the industry have been talking for a couple of years about what a reparations project would look like. Some way to take a lot of the money that's being generated in this industry and funnel it back to those neighborhoods or those communities in a way that actually works. It is a hard problem to solve. It really is. Yeah. But we have to, and we are talking to people more and more often these days about how to do it, but the industry sort of needs to come together and build something big.
Yeah, it needs to be talked about more often. Is there anything else you'd want to tell me, either about your business or cannabis or your personal life, anything at all, sort of to close on? What? No pressure.
I guess the only thing I would say is that people have a lot riding on CBD being this incredible substance that can fix everything. And it is a pretty extraordinary molecule, and it has this incredible safety profile. I mean, it's very hard to take too much of it, and it really does help with a bunch of things. But I think people need to sort of refocus and think about the revolution not being about CBD, but it being about hemp. Because if you look at the plant as a whole, there really are an extraordinary amount of things that the plant can do, and you know, there are all these other cannabinoids that it's going to be able to make, and then there's all of these other products that we talked about, like bioplastics and hempcrete and fiber. And at the end of the day, I think because it's such an unusual plant, I think if we're focused on the plant itself, we can be focused on how the plant itself can help to change how agriculture works and can kind of serve as a model for how farmers can do better than they have with these other crops. Because if you have a really strange, interesting plant that can do a lot of things, farmers have a lot of potential to differentiate themselves and to avoid commoditization. And I think this is a crop that will be good for farmers. And I think it can change the math for them.
Dr. Mowgli Holmes from Phylos Bioscience. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
All right, well, that almost does it for our show. But there is one more thing I want to share with you. So in the beginning of that interview, in talking to Mowgli about Portland, I mentioned the quality time I spent in the Portland bus station. I know it's not totally hemp related, but there's a story here that deserves a little more exploration. All right, so like I said, I was traveling on a bus from Seattle, Washington to Eugene, Oregon. It was late May 1997. I was eventually on my way to an internship in Boulder, Colorado. But at this point in the story, I was just riding the bus. And the person I was sitting next to was a woman about my age, early 20s. And, we talked for a while, as you do on a long bus ride. She was from Australia. She had been traveling through the Pacific Northwest with her boyfriend, but he had been detained at the Canadian border due to some kind of drug conviction, probably marijuana. So she was traveling alone. She was on her way to her sister's place, which I think was somewhere, maybe her sister lived on an island off the coast of Oregon. And she told me she was pregnant, that her boyfriend who had been detained at the border didn't know about that. She was freaked out and scared and was just hoping for the best. She also had this 12-string guitar with her, but she said she didn't know how to tune it. So at the Portland bus station, where I had a layover to catch the next bus to Eugene, and I guess she was catching her bus to wherever, I offered to tune it for her. And then she asked me if I knew any songs, and the first song that popped into my head was Down Under by Men at Work. So I played it for her, and then I got on the bus, and that's my Portland bus station story.
Traveling in a fried-out combi on a hippie trailhead full of zombies. I met a strange lady, she made me nervous. She took me in and gave me breakfast. I come from the land down under, where women blow and men plunder.
All right, so that does it for today's show. Thank you for listening. Thank you for everything. I really appreciate this work that I get to do, and I do appreciate that you listen to it. All right, my name is Eric Herlock. I'm the digital editor at Lancaster Farming Newspaper, the greatest agricultural newspaper in the world. Pick yourself up a copy or get yourself a subscription. Go to lancasterfarming.com. You can always reach me at podcast@lancasterfarming.com. You can also check us out on the Instagram at LFPodcastHemp. And what else? Well, that's it. All right. Thanks. Bye. See you next time. See you in the newspaper. This episode of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is copyright 2019 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, which is part of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show was written and recorded, edited, and produced by yours truly, Eric Herlock. Any music you hear is courtesy of the Tin Bird Shadow.
Industrial hemp. industrial hemp.